all of them saved. Now I forget to record them. We didn't miss too much though, just the first couple of slides, and I think geometric period art is not challenging. But yeah, this is a small bronze statue, possibly showcasing the battle between Heracles and Nessos, or the story of the Lapis and the centaurs, in which Heracles was part of it. In this story, the Lapis, or the ancient Greece people, the Lapis were supposedly the first people that lived in Greece, according to mythology. They were having a wedding festival, and they invited the centaurs, their longtime enemies, to the wedding. It's kind of like a peace offering. Hey, come to this wedding. Well, during the wedding, the centaur leader Nessos ends up kidnapping Heracles, or Hercules' bride, is their wedding, and rapes her. And that in turn starts a big battle between the centaurs and the Lapis. The Greeks, or Lapis, obviously win because they are civilized, and the centaurs, being the barbarians, lose. And that is kind of illustrated here. Anyone remember anything about this one?
I remember seeing it.
It's been a while.
Yeah,
It's been a while. It's been like 9-ish weeks for you.
Yeah.
It's been like a long time for you. First off, dimensions. What's wrong? Centaur's small. Lapis big.
Yeah, wasn't it opposite?
Yeah, normally horses are bigger than people. So you would assume that a horseman is bigger than a human. So here we have a little hierarchic scale going on. Like I mentioned, the Greeks considered themselves to be descendants of the Lapis and liked to think of themselves as better than really everyone else. So that's kind of showcased here.
And he was set off of that.
Yeah. Yeah, they did make sure to show both of them as male. This kind of shows you, though, that early on, artists didn't quite know how to illustrate these mythological figures. Like, what is a half man, half horse supposed to look like? So what they did is they made this front half all human. He even has human feet. And then there's a horse's butt coming off of his backside. Yeah, it's weird. Even though, like, the idea of a centaur is weird in and of itself. So I get it. I get the challenge that they probably faced. Like, what is this thing supposed to look like? But in today's light, we have an idea of like what it should look like, even though it's not real. And that's because of what happens to Greek art later, is they come up with this set rule of what a centaur looks like, which is not this. But yeah. This also shows some inspiration from Mesopotamians in Egypt, which will carry over into, for sure, Archaic period. This is towards the beginning of them trading with the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. And by characteristics, I just mean the strict profile poses and stiffness that's happening here. It also still obviously carries on some of the Aegean aspects as well, such as the small skinny waist. Now, like I mentioned, eventually the Greeks start to expand their trade networks into places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, as well as Asia Minor, which marks the beginning of what's considered the Orientalizing period, or the Oriental period. The Oriental period takes what the geometric period started, which is figures, and expands upon it to add less geometric shapes. and some more interesting composition. Movement, yeah. There's actual movement happening. It's not entirely stiff. Well, I mean, not real movement, but implied movement happening. We also see more than just black on Oriental pottery. They start using red as a pigment during this period, as well as white slip. So here we see a black slip pottery with a layer of white slip and then some more red added to it to create these designs. And for this, you can really see a lot of influence, particularly here from Mesopotamia, with their lion human head figures. This particular mythological symbol is from Mesopotamia. We also have boars, lions, rabbits, dogs, animal motifs. The curve is just an amphora jar. It's more pronounced on this one, but it's just the shape of an amphora. You can kind of see it on this one back here, but it's definitely more pronounced here. More Oriental art. This is a early supposed statue of Apollo. Of course, it's missing a lot of pieces, so you can't particularly tell which god it's supposed to be. But it's a very small bronze statue, just to show you a bronze statue from geometric period into the Oriental period. There are some carryovers from Aegean art from a particular statue that we didn't get to talk about last week. And if you looked in the book, you would have seen him, which is a long neck. This one obviously has a very long neck, but also the stiff Egyptian pose. We still have a little bit of a triangle happening here, but he does have an ab six-pack going on as well. He still has his thin waist from the Aegean. So this is really an amalgamation of different cultures coming together, and the Greeks are trying to figure out what they want to do with it. And this is what the particular artists that made this one came up with.
Is that supposed to be hair?
It is hair, yes.
Okay, so
his neck is here, and he's got hair off to the side in braids.
That kind of represents Egyptian. I mean, in comparison, like how they would have the beard.
Yeah, they would have the beard and the stiff hair.
So
well, they had the pharaoh's headdress over top, but it's the same kind of shape that they had. That's going to carry over into Archaic period. And that just happened to also be a particular hairstyle that was popular in the time too. With thick braids. So some more Oriental art. This is a two-handed amphora jar. It would have been used for storage purposes. The bands on these jars repurposed the band setting that popped up first in geometric period, and it's going to continue to be used later on as well. Just to show different registers, there's other groups of people that have used registers already too, such as the Mesopotamians and Egyptians also did that. But on it, it shows exotic animals, mythological figures. Up here at the top is like a harpy figure that's kind of faded away. Oh, a siren. That's what it was. I'm like, it's a harpy, but their version of a siren, like today we think of a siren as like a mermaid. Their version of a siren had wings. That's why I thought harpy. Which is weird, because I don't think wings. I think harpy. Or not harpy, siren. Siren, I think of mermaid. Maybe that's just me. But yeah, this is a black figure painting style. Black figure painting is going to be pretty popular until we get to the classical period, in which red figure is developed. Red figure gives you a lot more detail and depth, or the illusion of depth, than your black figure can do. Black figure, you're really predominantly limited with showcasing specific details on objects. But black figure does develop in Corinth. Red figure is going to develop in a different location. And that takes us to another period. Yes, another one. We've gone through geometric, oriental, and now we are getting to the very, very short-lived Daedalic art period, named after Daedalus, a mythological figure who popped up a long time ago in ancient Greece and pretty much gets credit for any really impressive piece of art and architecture in all of the ancient world. Literally anything. He's accredited with certain things in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome and Greece, even though he was not real. But yeah, in case you're curious who Daedalus is, this one I know does play. He was Icarus's daddy. You don't know who Icarus is? I'll find out. It should sound a little repetitive at this point. He ends up making the labyrinth. Yeah, he also tries to make wings, and well, he and Icarus end up flying a little too close to the sun and dying on their way back down. But yeah, so a mythological figure attributed with a whole lot of stuff, including monumental sculptures, such as kind of mentioned and hinted at that video. Hercules thought they were so real, he even punched them. So according to Greek mythology, Daedalus helped to invent these monumental, large, human-like sculptures in a colony in Egypt and helped bring them into Greece, which is where we get Daedalic art from this fake guy that didn't actually even probably do anything. Maybe it was a real person, I don't know. But this statue here, which is funny enough, only 2 feet high, all this was pretty impressive for them at this point in time. This is the first larger than a few inches tall figure that we've talked about for the Greeks. Lady of Auxerre is considered a work of the Daedalic period because she is so much more lifelike in comparison to the geometric and oriental sculptures that we've looked at so far. Is she amazingly lifelike? But she is a very great example of pre-archaic art, which is what's going to happen in a second. She looks very similar to the archaic period with her posture, her hairstyle, and her facial expressions. And of course, literally our next slide, I believe, is archaic. Yes, it is. So Daedalic art helps to form that bridge between geometric Oriental and the archaic period. And archaic period is, of course, the precursor for classical art, which is what most people think of when they think of Greek art. So slowly but surely, the Greeks are trying to work their way into creating something that looks lifelike. And this is really showcasing the early examples of that happening. This also, however, besides showing their venture into realism, shows that they still are attached to some abstraction. Any guesses as to how this is considered still slightly abstract? As in, what isn't real? What doesn't look real yet? What's still wrong? The waist. Yes, the waist is very small. What else? The hair is still really like, this is a braid. There's something else. The fingers are like crazy long and the hands really big. So proportions are definitely off. Her feet look really big too. Proportions are not quite there yet. So there's still like that abstract, this is a triangle. This is a little column here. This is a circle. They're still sticking to that basic shape, not really breaking out of that box yet. Eventually they will get there. Like it mentions there, and you can kind of tell she would have originally been painted. We don't know who it is. Could be a goddess, could be a regular person. Don't know. That does take us into the Archaic period, which is one of our three main periods of Greek art. If you're familiar with those three main periods, this is the first one. This is really when we start exiting that dark age for sure and entering into art and architecture that showcases what the Greeks were able to do. This period of art lasts from approximately 600 to 480 BCE, and it shows off Egyptian influence in Greece lifestyles. Because the statues we're about to look at are very much in the style of the Egyptians. Not that the last one we didn't look at wasn't, because it was too. Posture. Very stiff, very rigid. Which are pretty much the characteristics of the Archaic period. This is our earliest example from the Greeks of a piece of life-size statuary. It was copied from Egypt's model of life-size statues. However, there's a few differences. Anyone name the differences between this and Egyptian sculpture? The hair is braided and back. Huh?
I mean, he's in a different,
That's the same exact pose.
oh.
Same exact pose as Egyptian. Nothing's changed. Literally the same foot is stepping forward. He is naked. The Egyptians would never, ever, ever put someone naked up. Never. The Greeks, however, almost always have male nudes. The women usually are clothed unless it's a goddess, but the men are almost always naked. That has to do with, of course, social standing. Men are considered more important in the society, and the fact that the Greeks feel that human beings are the most close representation in relations to the gods and goddesses themselves. The Greeks consider humans to be perfect, as they are descended of gods and goddesses. So they want to capture that perfection. And the best way to show off a perfect being is to not clothe them, to really show off all of the muscles and the body. Of course, men are, like I mentioned, women are not as important, unless it's a goddess, and then she's naked, because we got to show off what she looks like, because she's perfect. I don't know how it makes sense in my head, but it kind of does, which is sad. Like I kind of get it, but anyways. Um, so yes, his stance is exactly the same as the Egyptians. His pose is very stiff, very rigid. Everything is aligned, even though technically it should not be. His knees are exactly the same height. His ankles are the same height. His hips are the same height. His shoulders. That's not how the body works. When you're stepping forward, things are not perfectly aligned. Things go off kilter a little bit. Some things are still a little bit off in this one, as it is one of the earlier examples. Like you guys mentioned with her, proportions. His head's a little big for his body. It's the big one there. His waist is also really skinny still. Eventually they'll veer away from that. But we do see some muscles being recreated. Particularly, they're focusing on the same exact muscles that the Egyptians focused on their pharaohs, which is the torso. Of course, with the pharaohs, you couldn't see anything else because they had clothes on. But yeah, very rigid, very Egyptian-like. And of course, another piece of archaic art. This one does have a kind of robe on, but it doesn't cover anything. Yeah. So this is the calf bearer. He's going to pop up again. What chapter am I working on right now? Because he pops up in that chapter. Christian art. Like I just read this yesterday. What was I reading? He pops up again in Christian art. He becomes, instead of just a calf bearer, however, a symbol for Christ. For obvious reasons. Yeah. But yeah, this is most likely Rhombus. This is dedicated by Rhombus, meaning Rhombus purchased it to be made. So it's most likely a statue of himself done for his like death. A bit morbid to think, but this isn't the first time that we've covered someone making stuff for themselves before they die. The pharaohs did that too. But yeah, most likely dedicated by Rhombus to the goddess Athena to show his appreciation for his prosperity to her, well, from her. Hence why he is carrying a calf on his shoulders. So he does have a little bit of a different pose for archaic sculpture. Most archaic men always have their fists to the side, but he is performing an action. He's carrying something. So not as stiff and rigid as, say, this one, but we still have that same standing there, 1 foot forward. You can kind of tell one of his feet was forward. Everything is aligned and even. He still has that same hairstyle, same dopey face. That smile right here that all of these guys have is called the archaic smile. It has a name. It's because all of them have it. All of them. We'll look at someone dying in a second. He's going to be smiling. I don't know many people that smile when they die, but yeah, the archaic smile. But yeah, he is bearded and wearing a cloak to indicate that he is an older gentleman versus this one, which is obviously a youthful figure. Koros itself stands for male youth or youthful male. This guy is trying to show his age and status in society by showing himself bearded, and that's why he's kind of clothed. Would he be walking around like this all the time in real life? No, he actually wore clothes, which is good. But yeah, in the statue, he was naked. Did he have a six-pack in real life? I don't know. That's how most archaic statues looked like. They would have muscles to try and show off the ideal human form, which at that point in time was muscular. Everyone's smiling here. I'm so glad you guys are enjoying this. Another Koros or youthful male. This one shows a progression towards more muscles. We started off with not many muscles, and now the muscles are slowly but surely getting more defined. This one also has some hip sphincters. Are those sphincters? That's what that's called. It's been a long time since I've taken biology. But the actual structure of the muscles in the hips are happening here. So we're getting a little bit more realistic. The head is also in a little bit more in proportion to his body. It looks kind of small to me, maybe just me though, but slightly more proportionate than the last two. And this one does have an inscription on it that says, "Stay and mourn at the tomb of dead Croesus, whom raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks," meaning that this fellow here died fighting in a battle. Ares is the god of war. I'm pretty sure Ares didn't kill him, but he died fighting in battle. Unless we're talking about Troy, and then, yeah. We all watched that last week. Ares fought and killed a lot of people. And now we're moving on to the Korae, the youthful female. Like I mentioned, most of the women were clothed. This, however, could possibly have been a goddess. We don't know. It could have been a priestess as well. There's a lot of speculation with this one. She does have a garment. She is named after her garment, which is a peplos, which is just a loose tunic with a belted waist. Different garments for females are going to be popping up as we cover this class, just to show you the fashion trends, I guess. I don't know. The hairstyles are also going to be changing as we go forward too. Fashion. She has that same braided hairstyle that the men had, same smile, and still that stiff, rigid pose. However, unlike the male counterparts, you can't really see what's going on under the garment. It's a loose fitting garment. She would have at one time been painted, and whatever she was holding in her outstretched hand would have told us what she was or who she was. But it's lost. We don't have it anymore. And our last Korae is the Ionian dress Korae. She's named after the Ionian dress that she's wearing, which is like a peplos. It has that same loose fitting belted garment, but she has another piece of fabric draped over her as well, kind of like a toga on top of it, which is the Ionian dress. The popular one for when she was made, which this one 530, this one 520, so about 10 years after. She too would have been painted. She would have at one point had an entire body as well. But the Ionian dress, in comparison to the peplos, peplos was a thicker, heavier garment. The Ionian dress was a lightweight, flowy garment. And the artist for this tried to capture that featherweight fabric on top with the folds. This is the first example that we've seen of the Greeks trying to capture a texture or real looking texture on a fabric.
Really cool.
Yeah, they did pretty good. You can even see that there's texture on the peplos when you do it.
Yeah.
The pose is also a little bit asymmetrical too. A lot of the Korae that we looked at were pretty symmetrical poses. Here, she's got one arm outstretched and the other one would have been down, kind of like the other Korae. Now, what's happening with architecture during the Archaic period? They're trying their hand at temples. That's what's happening. Are they amazing at it at the beginning? No. But they're going to get there. They're going to get there. The first temples that were built by the Greeks looked very similar to the Mycenaean palaces that we looked at on Thursday, so we're not going to look at any more of those. It was that same megaron structure of having the throne room with the open ceiling and the fire pit in the center. Instead of a throne, though, they would have a statue for a god or a goddess. So it looks really similar to that. But by the Orientalizing period, they did start trying to build normal looking temples. We'll see what those look like a little bit more though. So the early Greek temple plan, pretty similar to what late Greek temple plan is. They switch it up a little bit here and there. But the Greeks did have a pretty set standard mathematical system that they followed for everything. But yeah, so for these temples, they had an outer colonnade. And then they would have either an inner colonnade or this right here, which was a building that had two columns on each end identical. You would enter into this one for the cella or into this side for the domos. Inside of the cella would have been a statue for the god or goddess. Inside of the domos was where you would put your offering for the deity. That's going to switch up later on a little bit, but this is early temple. Most people didn't actually go inside. They would go in, offer up their offering, and pray outside of the temple. Usually only special people got to go into the statue area. Us regular folks, we would be asked to give our offering and then leave. Most early temples were supported with columns. The early column of choice was the Doric column. We'll get to the other columns in a second. Occasionally, though, they were also carried with caryatids. Caryatids are awesome. It's females. Female sculptures would sometimes support these massive structures. And we'll look at some of those too. Early caryatids not as impressive as classical caryatids, but yeah, because we're talking archaic sculptures, classical sculptures. Anyways, like I mentioned, Doric order was the most prevalent early order in Greek temples at the time. We'll talk about the second one to pop up next, which is the Ionic order. But the Doric order came from the Greek mainland area, meaning mainland Greece, not the island. The Ionic order is not going to come from mainland Greece, but that's not really important for you unless you care. You notice here that there are different drums to actually make up the column. Occasionally the columns would be made of one single piece of stone, but more often than not, there were drums, which is just the layers. Why they're called drums, I don't know, but they are. There's a lot of vocabulary word here in case you're catching on. On the Doric order, there would always be fluting. Those are those lines there. Most Greek columns had fluting. The Romans do not always have fluting on their columns. They're a little different. And then, of course, at the top of your column is the capital. The capital is what gives these columns their name. The Doric column has, of course, the plainest capital. It's just this very plain thing here. I don't know what to describe that as. On top of the capital for both the Ionic and Doric columns is the abacus, which is a little rectangular slate to help balance things out. And then with the Doric order, you have your architrave, which was sometimes decorated with a frieze. More often than not on a Doric order, it was left plain. And then you have your frieze and your metopies. For the Doric order, most of your sculptural reliefs would be in the metopies. They wouldn't normally have it in the architrave. I'm saying normally. And then on top of the metopy and frieze area is your cornice. And on top of the cornice would be your pediment, which is your triangle. The little three-lined area right here is called the triglyph. Tri meaning three, glyph. Yeah, you get it. That separates each metopy section. I'm going through all of this because every single order had its own set of rules. This is the Doric order's rule. You didn't know that, did you? They all have their own set of rules. For example, with the next order, the Ionic order, you are not allowed to have metopes. And you were required to have a base. The Doric order does not have a base. The base is found at the bottom of the column. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Sometimes all of these drums would be held together with a long piece of metal, like a pole, to keep it in place. Usually the easiest way to keep things in place. Questions about the Doric order? It's very dense, isn't it? I don't like architecture that much, so it's a bit dense for me. I get a bit bored when I'm reading these sections. I'm trying to make them as easy as possible. Next order, invented later in the Aegean region, meaning those islands that we talked about on Thursday. Of course, those island people long gone. Now it's the Greeks that are in control. And they helped come up with the Ionic order. For a long time on mainland Greece, they refused to use the Ionic order because it wasn't theirs. It was the Aegean people. Eventually, they will adopt in the Ionic order. They do the same thing with the last order, the Corinthian order, which we aren't talking about today because it was invented during the Hellenistic era, but they didn't like that one either because it wasn't theirs. But with the Ionic order, you have a base. With the last order, the Corinthian order, there's also a base. There's fluting on this one as well for the shaft. You'll notice that with the Ionic order, it's skinnier than the Doric order. The Doric order is very bulky and heavy. So later on, architects are going to prefer the Ionic order because it's skinnier and it's not quite as heavy looking. Eventually they'll get there, eventually. And then eventually they'll really like the Corinthian order because you don't have to do stupid stuff with this thing, the volute. When this volute was on a corner, they had to put a volute on this side and a volute on this side, and it looks dumb because they wanted it to be the same. If you only put it on one side, it's not going to look the same. The Corinthian order solves that problem because it's the same all the way around. Doric order doesn't really have that problem either because it's the same all the way around. Ionic order brought its own challenges because of this volute, which is the capital that the Ionic order is known for. You'll also notice above this one, there is an abacus as well. It's just a different kind of abacus. It has a little bit of a pattern to it. These are called dentals. These are dentals too. It's a little recessed area of ridges. And they're called dentals because they look like teeth. And of course, you have an architrave on this one as well as a frieze. This frieze does not have metopes or high triglyphs. However, it is blank. That is because there would be relief sculpture all around this instead of just in the small window sections, the metopes. On top of that is your cornice, and then on top of the cornice is your pediment. And we're not done with architecture. There's more. So finally, we're going to get to a temple. From the Archaic period, this is the Basilica at Paestum. This is a Doric temple. It is technically located in Italy, but it's located in a region of Italy that was owned by the Greeks at this point in history. It is an interesting example of a Doric temple because it is such an old example. Normal Doric temples are going to look much different from this first early example. It is named a basilica because that's what the Romans called their meeting halls, but this is a temple. Eventually, that same basilica format is going to be used for Christian churches. This temple was dedicated to the goddess Hera, the wife of Zeus, mother of many gods and goddesses, also angry lady. Angry lady. It does have, like I mentioned, some unusual features though. For example, I think first glance, you can see that the capital on this door column is like a pancake. That's not normal. Not normal. This one is also chunky. It's fat. It's got kind of a curve to it, not normal. Not a normal column. They also had a central row of columns leading right down the middle of the temple. Normally you wouldn't do that because it throws off the balance. Also, when you're looking into the temple, you want to have a direct view of the statue. If there's a row of columns in the middle, you can't do that. But they had to put the middle row of columns there because the ceiling was too heavy. They needed that added support. Later on, the Greeks are going to figure out how to build temples without putting a row of columns down the center, but it's going to take some time. There's also, like I mentioned, no central doorway, which is pretty normal for all of these Greek and later Roman temples to view that statue. This doorway is off to this side. And there's an odd number of columns. Odd numbers are no-nos in Greek architecture and art styles. They don't do that. It throws off the balance of the entire building when you start using odd things, especially when your whole goal is symmetry. You can't get symmetrical things with odd numbers. The columns are also a lot closer spaced than later Doric or Ionic columns are going to be. That's because they had to add so many columns to once again support the structure. Eventually, they will figure it out. This particular temple is very much concerned with structural support rather than it is concerned with being a temple, as in the decorative sense. There's another temple, Temple of Hera II, that we're going to talk about tomorrow, because this one was vacated for the new one, which is right next door to it. They're right next to each other. Yeah. But, first off, some of the decorations on these temples. This is a decoration for the Temple of Artemis from Corfu. Just to give you an idea of how these temples were decorated. During the Archaic period, they were already using relief sculptures to decorate things. They expand upon this and enhance this during the Classical period, because of course they get better at sculpting. But even during this period, they were trying to figure out how to balance and fill up this space in an interesting format. To do so, they used things like animals as space fillers because you can make animals laying down and they work great, as well as gods and goddesses and humans. So here we have Medusa in the center. You wouldn't think of like having Medusa as the main central figure, but she works in the same way as those scary lions did that we talked about last week, to ward off evil. Not so much scare people off, but to ward off evil from this temple's presence. So here we have Medusa, and I got to read this one because there's a lot of people. So give me a second. She's flanked with her two cats, and let's see. She has, Pegasus is missing now. Pegasus doesn't exist. Pegasus was over on this side. And then her other child, Chrysaor, is over here. Yes, because the snake-headed lady birthed Pegasus and Chrysaor. She had a horse. It's just weird. And then over on the far corners are Achilles fighting King Priam and killing him. And then over on the other side is a figure laying down, and I don't remember who it is because I didn't write it. I'm sorry. I can't remember all of these people sometimes because there's a lot. And this one is not normal. Normally the stories all kind of go together. For this one, the artist was trying to choose things that fit that space. He's like, okay, I can make this Medusa really big because she's important, versus the human figures like Achilles and King Priam, I can make them small because they're humans. So trying to come up with stories that kind of worked with the temple, but also fit that pediment. And we will see other artists later on use things like animals as space fillers because they fit things easy, because you can make them do different poses and it makes sense, such as the cats laying down here. And we're going to actually skip this one, but if you're interested in reading it, it is our early example of caryatids. I will mention that this is the treasury at Delphi. which did at one point, they no longer are there, have two caryatids in archaic style, two chores. One of them was a peplos chore, the other one was your ionic dress chore, holding up the weight of the structure. Your caryatid is just a female sculpture that acts as a column. So it's the third kind of column, I guess. And that takes us into some pottery from the archaic period. I'm trying to see how much more, because I wanted to get done with the archaic period today. Okay, no, I won't skip this one because it's kind of interesting. The Athenians start taking over the pottery market during the archaic period, and they really pride themselves on that black figure pottery. The pottery market becomes so competitive that this is one of our first examples of artists making sure to label the art as theirs, because they wanted people to know, I made this one, because they wanted to make money off of it and get the credit for it. It was really competitive. We'll see that more when I get to the next slide. But this is the Francois vase. This one is interesting because this particular artist decided to label every single thing in this image. Sometimes he even labeled trees. Shield, sword, everything is labeled. You can kind of see it close up here, which is kind of weird. You can also see that the idea from the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians of having profile and composite view has carried over into Greece finally, particularly on their pottery. This particular vase, in case you're wondering what's going on, tells the story of Peleus and Achilles, and they're performing Centauromachy, which is just that story of the lapis and the centaurs fighting each other. And of course, no awesome artists, they kind of figured out how to do a centaur at this point. They are still using bands, and those bands help create ground lines on which the figures can stand. Eventually, they'll stop relying on those different bands to show space, but not yet. Like I was mentioning a second ago, the pottery market was super competitive. Ezekias is one of those early potters that became really, really famous. This is his Achilles and Ajax playing a dice game. Really, really well-known piece of pottery here. It is black figure pottery. We're going to see this again in a second when we look at the next slide. Known for being able to actually detail these shapes and making these figures recognizable and individualized, also creating very innovative compositions. So you'll notice with these figures, the actual shape of the amphora is echoed in their postures. That is to try and create a aesthetically pleasing composition. So versus like this one, who's just trying to cram as much of the story on as possible. He's trying to think about what he's doing to try make it pleasing to look at, which is new. It's not happened before. Before they were just trying to show what's happening and show the story. This guy, not concerned with that, which is one of the reasons why he becomes so popular. People want to purchase his stuff and show it off because it looks nice in comparison to the other pottery. Now, later on, when the invention of red figure happens, this one's red figure. I think you can tell the difference between black figure and red figure. The figures are red now. With the invention of red figure pottery, people weren't sure if it was going to take off. So they would do something called bilingual vases, on which one side would be black figures and on the other side they'd have red figures. So literally mirror images of each other. Here is Anakides painter, who was a student of Ezekias. He was trying his hand at the same exact composition, just with his own styles. You can kind of see some of the differences. It has no helmet, different kind of facial expressions, different attire. So trying his own hand at the same composition, but then on the opposite side, he tried out red figure with that same story. Now, what are some of the things that you notice with red figure versus black figure? Looking at this bilingual vase. I can blow it up for you.
The difference.
Yeah.
I mean, on the right, you got the two guys actually sitting on red stools.
Yeah, so we can actually make out the stools. There's a detail on the stools.
There's
Yeah.
The shield.
There's details on the shield. Yeah. There's actual
details
painting.
everywhere.
There's details everywhere. Exactly. So with the invention of red figure, you can actually add these small details because before you were making a reverse image. With black figure, it's a reverse image. You can't make all of those details. It's basically a negative if you're making a photograph. With red figure, you can get all of those fine details, including facial expressions now, which is kind of nice. Some people did not like red figure and didn't gravitate towards it. Some people preferred red figure. And we're going to end off today with Euphronius and his big competitor. Euphronius ends up becoming one of the forerunners of a red figure pottery. Here is Heracles wrestling Antoneus, sorry, had to think about that one. Antoneus. Antoneus is one of the mythological figures. Supposedly when he was on the ground, he was unbeatable. But the second that he got off of the ground and wasn't attached to the ground, because he's a giant, he's connected to the earth. Once he's taken off the ground, he's powerless. So Heracles in this myth lifts Antoneus off the ground and beats him in the air, where he is still weak, and that is how he defeats the giant. However, Euphronius decided to really showcase Heracles because in this image is Antoneus off the ground. Or is he on the ground?
No.
On, what?
No.
Well, our ground's here. This is our ground line.
Yeah.
He's still on the ground. So this artist did not follow the myth. He decided that he was going to really show off Heracles' strength by showing his own version in which Heracles wrestles Antoneus on the ground and beats him there. And here you can really see the strained facial expression of Antoneus as he is being suffocated. We have a facial expression with emotion. Oh my gosh. There's also some foreshortening happening with the torsos on these gentlemen. We aren't in strict profile or composite view. There's some depth and dimension as well with the hair on Antoneus particularly. He has actual hair. It's not one black blob, although Heracles is still like that. So Euphronius was doing some pretty innovative stuff with his pottery, which is one of the reasons, well, the main reason why people wanted to buy his stuff, because he was doing different stuff. Now, his main competitor was this guy, Euthymides. Euthymides was also trying to do new stuff to try and compete with Euphronius. Here's another Euphronius, by the way, in case you're interested. This is the most expensive piece of pottery ever bought. For $1.2 million in 1972. But yeah, this is Euphronius's major rival and competitor. Euthymides hated Euphronius so much that he, on this vase, signed to the artwork, "Euthymides painted me as never Euphronius could do," as in Euphronius can't do this. No way he can do this. This is me. So once again, we have a lot of interesting positioning going on. We don't have profile, we don't have composite, we have buttocks. This figure is completely twisted around. We see his butt, we see his back, and then he's twisting around to the side, really trying to create dynamic poses and compositions that had not been used before in Greek pottery. And like I said, he's just really trying to compete and keep up with Euphronius. I mean, yeah, it is what it is. This was most likely not done as like a finished piece. It was done as a figural study to like study the human body and what happened in different poses. And our last piece of pottery is another one which really shows how portrayal of the human figure has progressed throughout the archaic period from our strict New York core to these depictions on pottery. But of course, you still have your temples. This one's a slightly improved temple from Paestum. The columns have thinned out quite a bit. And now there are 2 rows of columns on the inside, so you can have a central door. And of course, this is an interior of that in case you're interested what it actually really looks like. And on it are these pediment pictures, which is where we will pick up tomorrow because it kind of leads into these pediments from that temple of Aphia show the beginning, well, not really the beginning, but like the middle era of the Archaic period and the end of the Archaic period entering into early classical. So that's where we're going to pick up tomorrow. Like I said, there's a lot to cover with the Greek period. It's not a short one, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know. Depends on you. This